pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Humanities Forum. We have a very distinguished guest with us this afternoon, and it's an honor to welcome him to Providence College. Today's event is also a special collaborative event with the Jewish and Catholic Theological Exchange here at Providence College. And to offer some welcoming remarks on behalf of the Exchange, please welcome Arthur Urbano up to the podium.
Going to have to lower this microphone a little bit, I think. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Arthur Urbano. I'm a faculty member in the Theology Department and also chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange, which is co-sponsoring the event today with the Humanities Forum. For the past 10 years, the JCTE has been doing programming that fosters interreligious learning and mutual understanding between Jews and Catholics. And we have two events coming up this semester. On October 11th, we are co-sponsoring a Theology on Tap with Campus Ministry on the theme of Shabbat on Sabbath, and faculty and students are welcome to that. That's October 11th at 7 p.m. And we also have a lecture by Professor David Kurtzer from Brown University on November 4th, which is a Sunday, at 4:30 p.m., but you'll see some emails going around about that. If anyone's interested in being on our email list, please see me after today's event, and I'll be glad to put you on our list. And let me just say it's a great pleasure for us to be co-sponsoring the event today and the talk by Professor Alter. So it's a good opportunity for Jewish Christian learning. So thank you.
Please now join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Keating from the Theology Department, who will introduce this afternoon's guest.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see everyone, although I guess there's no playing outside this afternoon. It's all rainy and wet, so this is a great alternative. We're super happy and honored to have Dr. Robert Alter, who is a professor of the Graduate School and Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California in Berkeley. He is the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California, as well as being emeritus. His list of books and articles is very, very long, nearly 200, so I'm not going to read all of them. I just wanted to pull out a few of the very distinguished examples. In the year 2000, he published Canon and Creativity, which was chosen as the LA Times list of best books for the year 2000, and was also selected by Choice as one of the best scholarly books of 2000-2001. He has also won the Koret Special Award for Translation for the 5 Books of Moses, the PEN USA Translation Award for the same 5 Books of Moses, and the Charles Homer Haskins Award in 2013 from the American Council of Learned Sciences. He has received numerous honorary doctorates, a doctorate of humane letters from the University of Judaism, an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the University of Haifa, et cetera, many of these. Among his published books and articles, the ones that I just want to draw your attention to, some of you are actually using these in class, the Book of Psalms, a translation with commentary, the Wisdom books, also translation with commentary, Ancient Israel, the Former Prophets. Another very important scholarly work, Pen of Iron, American Prose in the King James Bible, published by Princeton University Press in 2010. And more recently, Strong as Death is Love, the Song of Songs, Ruth, Esther, Jonah, and Daniel. I could go on, but I will stop. And we were very happy. Please welcome me, with me Dr. Robert Alter.
Thank you, Professor Keating. Okay, you hear me all right? Yes. When you list all these publications, I always think of that expression in a novella by Henry James, when I think it's the narrator says that I'm a publishing scoundrel. Now, let me explain. I'm very happy to be here, and I've already been made to feel quite welcome. I'm going to do something a little odd mechanically, which I'll explain. I left my reading glasses in my hotel room. I'm not going to read a text, let me, but occasionally I may want to refer to my notes, and if I do, I'll turn on the bright light from my cell phone so I can see the text. Now, something peculiar has happened in the reception history of the Bible. By the Bible, of course, I mean both Testaments, but especially the Hebrew Bible, for a couple of particular reasons. One is that I'm somebody who does Hebrew and I have a more intimate sense of it. But also, I think that the literary articulation of the Hebrew Bible, the subtlety and precision and complexity of its narratives and the power of its poetry are quite remarkable. Now, of course, the Gospels are very moving stories, but they're a little different, perhaps partly because the central figure in the four Gospel narratives is a human being who is, let's say, infused with the divine, so that makes him rather different from a character in an ordinary literary narrative. Now, what happened over the centuries is that readers lost touch with the literary aspects of the Bible. Now, when I say literary aspects, this is something I've put in print a few times. I in no way diminish the status of the Bible as a set of religious texts, but what I'm saying is that these writers of ancient Israel, for reasons that we can't quite fathom, chose to cast their vision of God and humankind and creation and what God demands of humanity in a highly sophisticated literary form. And I think that if you want to get at the religious vision, you need to see the literary form more sharply. But we stopped doing that, and we stopped doing that for obvious reasons. That is, both Christians and Jews regarded the Bible as divinely inspired. So it was to be read for theological truths and for, let's say, moral instruction. And when you do that, you stop looking at other things. So over the centuries, a certain amount of amnesia set in about what was going on with the literary structures of the Bible. And I'll give you two quick, I don't mean to give an introduction to biblical narrative here, but I'll give you two quick illustrations. There is an original, I'm going to separate out two what I think are original literary conventions that you find in biblical narrative. One I designated many years ago, stealing a term from Homer's scholarship, as type scene. Now, we all probably at least vaguely recognize when we read the Bible that the same story seems to be happening to different characters. For example, there's a story especially in Genesis and Exodus, of a young man or his surrogate who goes to foreign territory, and in the foreign territory he meets a young woman at a well, and then somebody draws water, usually it's the young woman, in one case it's the young man. Then word is sent home, always with the verb rush or hurry, of the arrival of the stranger. A feast is laid out, which turns out to be a betrothal feast. At the end of the feast, conditions are agreed on for a marriage, and then they marry and live sometimes happily ever after, not quite always, because the biblical writers were great realists. Now, this, I believe, is a highly distinctive literary convention, because when you look at the different occurrences of it, when the occurrence in the case of Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Moses, and the kind of gender reversed occurrence of it in the book of Ruth, and a couple of deflected instances of what I call the betrothal type scene, even though the general pattern is there in each instance, the details have subtly been altered to fit the particular story and the particular character. But we forgot that this was a convention. So what you find in the scholarly literature is that this is simply a repetition of the same story, maybe a hiccup of oral transmission, and so on and so forth. Okay, what my one other, that's on the macro textual level. On the micro textual level, another original literary convention, which I think is startlingly effective at times, is near verbatim repetition. Now, it's a bit surprising, since we know how economical biblical narrative is, that in many instances the same thing seems to be repeated in the same words. So why are they doing that? The fact of the matter is that the repetitions almost always swerve from the verbatim at some crucial point, or maybe 2 or 3 crucial points. And those swerves open a window of meaning or perspective. Again, this has been entirely forgotten. So let me give you one very simple example. Most of you probably remember the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. That she's the lustful lady who is the wife of his master. He's a slave. He's a slave, but he's a major domo. He's a very enterprising slave. And she casts her eye on him and lusts for him, and it says, it's only 2 words in the Hebrew, 3 in translation, lie with me. No preliminaries or anything like that. And he resists quite volubly. How could I do such a thing? My master entrusted everything in my hand, and so on and so forth. Finally, one day, when no one else is around, she says, lie with me. He again resists, and this time she translates her words into action. She grabs, I imagine it's some kind of short tunic, to go by the pictorial evidence we have of the ancient Egyptians. And she tears it off his back, leaving him naked, and he runs out of the house. Now, this is first reported by the narrator, and then when she decides the right move to make, she calls out to the people of her house, help, help, or rape, rape, and claims that Joseph has attempted to rape her. She uses exactly the same words, except she alters the order. That is, the crying out in her version comes before he flees, where we, the readers, know that it came after he fled as part of a frame-up. But here is the symptomatic illustration of how modern scholarly readers of the Bible get things wrong. When she then turns to the household staff, who are presumably slaves, and she says of her husband, the Hebrew look, the Hebrew man that he brought to us came to me to lie with me, which is a shocker, of course. When her husband comes home, she says to him, look, the same words exactly, with one word change. He says, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us to mock us, I left that out, or to toy with us, came into me to lie with me. Now, a standard Protestant translation, the New English Bible, I was shocked to discover fairly recently. In the first instance, when she is speaking to the household staff, they translate the Hebrew slave whom my husband brought to me. Now, that totally erases an important effect in the Hebrew. Why? When she's talking to the people of the household, she says the Hebrew man, ish ivri. She says that because she doesn't particularly want to remind them of his status as a slave, because they're slaves also. So instead, what she wants to do is to enlist their sense of solidarity as Egyptians. This Hebrew man, this wild Semitic rapist from the north, tried to assault me. Whereas when she uses exactly the same words to her husband, she changes that one word. And now she says the Hebrew slave instead of the Hebrew man. Why? Because to her husband, she wants him to be aware of the fact that his slave had the presumption to try to assault her. And you see how that evaporates entirely if you stick slave in the first speech. It's part of an impulse of modern translators to think that you have to explain everything all along the way, so that if he was a slave, then stick the word slave in. So a small illustration of where losing a perspective on the Bible as a set of sophisticated literary techniques and conventions really leads you to mislead the stories. And also, although I won't be talking about poetry, the poetry as well. Now, things begin to change. Now, of course, I don't want to make a blanket generalization. There were Jewish and Christian readers through the Middle Ages and even in late antiquity who picked up a lot of literary signals. Because even if you think it's nothing but doctrinal or theological, you don't exactly turn off all the switches in your head. But I won't take any time to illustrate that. Things begin to change in the 18th century. Why that should be so is maybe a matter of intellectual history, which is a little too complicated for the present occasion. But in 1753, an Anglican bishop named Robert Lowth, Lowth, gave a set of lectures on the sacred poetry of the Hebrews at Oxford University. Of course, he gave them in Latin, because after all, he wasn't addressing ignoramuses. But they were path-breaking, and they were path-breaking in the following way. He was the first person very explicitly to see that biblical poetry was built on a formal structure in which the second half of the line semantically parallels the first half of the line. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. I think Bishop Loth's principle has to be refined and even qualified, because there are developments as well as synonymity between the first and the second half of the line. But it was a breakthrough. And why I would like to single it out is because it was a recognition that biblical poetry, like any body of poetry, has a formal structure. That is, you may read the poetry of Isaiah, or you should read it, I think, for its prophetic vision, but the prophetic vision is conveyed in a vehicle of beautifully wrought poetry, and if you see how the poetry is wrought, you see a lot more about the vision. So that was one major way station in the 18th century, and about 2 decades later, the German philosopher J.G. Herder, H-E-R-D-E-R, published, fortunately not in Latin, but in good German, which everybody understands, a book on Hebrew poetry, which he celebrated in the same breath and asks us to appreciate in the same way that we appreciate the poetry of Sophocles or even the poetry of Homer. By the way, he was also a Protestant clergyman. He was a Lutheran minister. So there's not necessarily a conflict between faith and the literary perspective in all these cases. Now, if one asks, which is my task here this afternoon, what is the relation of the Bible to the Western literary tradition? There are 2 ways in which I'm going to answer this. One is the Bible as a reservoir of allusions, and the second is the Bible as a model for formal literary technique. So the allusion thing is pretty easy to tick off. It's by no means limited to the modern period. It tends to be more common in Protestant countries than in Catholic countries, because as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, until fairly recently, the Catholic Church preferred to keep the Bible in Latin. Preferred maybe is a pale word, because the first person to translate both Testaments, he didn't complete the Old Testament for a reason which I'll explain in a minute, William Tyndale, in the 1520s. He was, I think, a translator of genius, and without his translation, the King James Version would have not been possible a century later. In any case, it was dangerous to translate the Bible, and Tyndale fled England to Belgium, where he was captured by the Inquisition, strangled, and then burned at the stake. So it used to be more dangerous to translate the Bible than it is now. I mean, I've had a couple of bad reviews, but that's not quite the same thing. Okay, so for once Luther translated the Bible into German, which is a century before Tyndale, and then Tyndale, followed by others in England, translated to English. Those countries became Bible readers. So it's not surprising that the Bible should be important in their literatures. But of course, there are other instances. For example, the the 17th century French tragedian Racine wrote a play called Athalie about based on the life reported in the Book of Kings of the wicked Queen Athaliah. And she was very wicked indeed. When her son the king died, she proceeded to murder all her grandsons, although one escaped, so that she could have exclusive claim to the throne. So the story of Athaliah, the story of Esther, attracted 17th century French playwrights. In the 18th century, one of the most delightful adaptations of a biblical episode is in Henry Fielding. You all probably know him as the author of Tom Jones, but his earlier novel, which is quite wonderful in its own way, though not quite with the scope of Tom Jones, Joseph Andrews, is about a sexually virtuous young man whose name is Joseph Andrews. So we go back to the same Joseph that I spoke about a few minutes ago, who resisted the advances of Mrs. Potiphar. And in the case in Fielding's novel, he is twice subjected to an attempted seduction by the lady for she's called Lady Booby, Lady Booby, who has recently been widowed and decides she might very well console herself with this beautiful young man who works for her. And of course, like the biblical Joseph, he resists. There are two scenes like this in the Bible, in Fielding's novel, and they're both, I think, very funny. Then one finds biblical materials elsewhere, even in Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare wrote almost all his plays before the appearance of the King James Version in 1611, although he's pretty close chronologically to that important moment. But just to fill you in, after William Tyndale's translation project was cut short by the Inquisition, in the middle of in the 1560s, I guess it was, certain Protestants fled England when Mary became queen, because Mary was a fanatic Catholic. I hope I'm not saying indiscreet things in a Catholic school, and she had a certain penchant for burning Protestants at the stake. So they went to Geneva, and they took Tyndale's translation and filled in the books that were missing and expanded it and revised it. And this became the Geneva Bible, which for quite a few decades was the available English Bible. But by the way, a funny personal experience, when my 5 books of Moses came out, it was reviewed in the New Yorker by John Updike, of blessed memory, one must say. I do admire him as a novelist. And he was a little, let's say, dyspeptic, out of sorts about my translation. He said, the problem is that this book is so heavy, it's hard to hold. He says, and that's because of the commentary. He said, the King James Bible didn't need a commentary. Now, it didn't have a commentary. Why didn't it have a commentary? Because the Geneva Bible did. and the Geneva Bible had an anti-monarchic commentary. So King James I wasn't having anything of this. No commentaries, you guys. So in any case, I'll mention two quick instances in Shakespeare and then move on to the modern period. The witches at the beginning of Macbeth, prophesying a dire end to the man who becomes king and will not hang on to his kingship, has a definite kinship with something that occurs at the end of the Saul story, which is Saul about to confront the Philistines in desperation because nothing else works, comes to a necromancer, that is, a woman who can summon up the spirits of the dead. This is the only instance of a ghost in the whole Bible. When Saul persuades her to summon up the spirit of the dead Samuel, who had ended up being his implacable enemy, he says, well, what's going to happen tomorrow? And Samuel, true to his colors and his relation to Saul, says, tomorrow you and your friends, you and your sons are with me. So you can see how that would resonate in the witch's story in Macbeth. And then in Hamlet, and I'm citing things that I think are familiar to all of you. You have, you remember the Hamlet stages this play within a play, which parallels what he sees as the story of the murder of his father by Gertrude and her new husband. And when in the scene that ends his plans for the play, he says, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Well, in the David story, we have something, it's not a play because there was no drama in ancient Israel, but something exactly like that. That is, the prophet Nathan comes to David and he tells him the story of the poor man's ewe, E-W-E. When David hears this story, how this rich man has expropriated the poor man's ewe and then slaughtered it, he stands up and says that this man will pay a severe penalty. And then Nathan says, you are the man. So that's the parable catching the conscience of the king. Then as another element in that same story, which is the story of the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder by David's proxies, basically, of her husband Uriah, he sends Uriah back to the battlefield with a sealed letter, knowing that because he's a loyal soldier, he would never dream of opening the sealed letter. And the sealed letter is his death sentence, which he gives to Joab, David's general. So that's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the same device. So you see, great writers were aware of the Bible, even if biblical references didn't swim all over the place. I think that in the modernist period, going back to the teens and 20s of the previous century, these biblical allusions become far more abundant. Not, well, of course, there is, let me correct myself, there is one great literary text in the 19th century in America which almost makes no sense without the Bible, and that's Melville's Moby Dick, where you have not only the Leviathan from the book of Job, you have the Jonah story, you have the story of Elijah, and also many of those magnificent lines that scan almost as iambic pentameter and remind you of Shakespeare also remind you of the King James version of Psalms. So, but in the 20th century, writers have been more inclined to tap into the Bible. I think it's partly because, especially in the modernist movement, it's probably less true now, there's a powerful recapitulative impulse in modernist writing. That is, to go back to early sources, biblical and other, and to rework them, to use them as a kind of platform on which to build something new. And I will take one example, certainly one of the greatest novels written in the 20th century, which is James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, Joyce tells you, of course, by the very title, that the book is modeled on Homer's Odyssey. Leopold Bloom, the middling, muddling through everyman who's at the center of the book, is a modern Odysseus, a modern Ulysses. And like Homer's Odysseus, he's trying to come home, home being Molly. And in a way, he's been sexually and otherwise far away from her, as Homer's Odysseus is far away from Penelope. And there are many intricate parallels from one episode to the next in Joyce's Ulysses with episodes in the Odyssey. But it's maybe a little less recognized that Joyce coordinates with all these intricate references to Homer, intricate references to the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible. I won't work them all out here for you because my time is limited, but let me say that in trying to come home, Bloom is also the Jewish people trying to return from the Babylonian exile, and Molly, his beloved but partly estranged wife, is the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and there are specific citations of the milk and honey thing to which Bloom wants to return. And even Zionism, which had been formulated about 9 years before the fictional date in which the events of Ulysses take place, Zionism enters into it too. There's when Bloom goes, of all places, to the pork butcher. What he buys is wrapped in a newspaper. This is before plastic bags, which are now going out. And in the newspaper is an advertisement for a Zionist settlers organization that wants to create orchards in the Holy Land. And it goes on and on. Bloom is also a Moses figure. And in a weird way, he is bringing the ethical truth in all his fumbling, he's not a xenophobe, he's not a fanatic, he has a loving heart. So he brings a kind of 20th century equivalent of the Ten Commandments to these benighted Dubliners. Okay, I'll mention two more examples, and then I want to go on to the business of techniques in the Bible. Kafka's America, which is a novel not completed like all three of his novels, about a young man who is, after a sexual scandal, which is not his fault, he's sent to America by his parents. And again, first of all, America is the promised land, as in Bloom, as in Bloom's vision of the promised land. But it's also the house of bondage. It's paradoxically, it's Egypt. And in fact, the hotel in which Carl Rossman, the protagonist, works as an elevator boy is in a town somewhere north of New York, it's left vague, called Ramesses. And Ramesses, of course, is one of the two store cities that the Hebrew slaves in Exodus are said to build for Pharaoh. And there are a number of other parallels to the Exodus story, as well as a scene that is a grotesque and hilarious replay of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. That seemed to appeal to a number of writers. Okay, finally, I will mention what may well be the greatest American novel of the 20th century, William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. Now, of course, those words are taken directly from 2 Samuel chapter 18, which I know some of you have recently read, when David learns of the death of his son. He says, Absalom, Absalom, my son, would that I had died in your stead. But the connection with the David story is much more elaborate than that. The enigmatic central figure, Thomas Sutpen, is a David figure, somebody who comes from nowhere and ends up building a kind of little empire, an empire based on the system of slavery in the Old South. And the central insight, I think, that Faulkner provides, you see, illusion is a two-way street. I want to stress that. That is, the old text enriches the new text. The new text may also throw light on the old text. So what Faulkner understands about the David story is that the story of the rise of David is paradoxically a story about the fall of the house of David, beginning with the grim curse that Nathan, the prophet, pronounces on David after the adultery with Bathsheba. So this is what happens to Thomas Sutpen. He builds this grand southern mansion with the white pillars and the whole deal, and it all collapses. So that's, you might say that is profound biblical interpretation as well as an original novel. Okay, now briefly, I don't want to try your patience too long. I'd like to move on to the question of literary structures. Now, in poetry, well before Bishop Lowth discovered the principle of parallelism, it was understood by readers of the Bible in translation that at least the book of Psalms was poetry. And one way you know, and of course it was very widely, I suppose it's maybe one of the most read biblical texts. People kept little copies of Psalms at their bedside. So one way you can tell that it was read as poetry is that it was a fairly standard exercise in Renaissance England for poets to produce verse translations, usually rhyming translations of the Psalms. Now, they didn't know the original language, but basing themselves on translation, they then transposed this into poetry. So they knew it was poetry and had to be in verse. I think the Song of Songs, really among the greatest assemblages of love poetry from the whole ancient world, got across to readers as fine lyric poetry and had its influence. And then just as, I mentioned the King James Psalms and Melville, I should also mention the King James Psalms and the poetry of Walt Whitman, which really wouldn't have come about had he not been reading these poems from the Book of Psalms in translation. Okay, let me move on very quickly to narrative. There are certain ways in which the Bible anticipates developments in later Western literature, even if that anticipation was not fully recognized. So I'm not necessarily talking about a causal chain, but a kind of convergence. Okay, first, so I'm going to single out three aspects of biblical narrative, of which is, well, first, before formal aspects, if you think about the David story that many of you have been reading, or you think about the patriarchal tales in Genesis, you have something that doesn't exist in the same way in ancient epic, but you will find resurgent in the novel, which is psychological complexity, an interest in the tensions of everyday life, an interest in sibling rivalry. Really the greatest accounts in ancient literature of sibling rivalry, I think, are in the book of Genesis. And the extravagances and problematic side of paternal love, conflict between paternal love and political necessities in the case of David. Again, you see it in the rebellion of Absalom. And then maternal love, Rebecca and many others, is an extremely important feature of these stories. But let me go on now to three technical aspects of biblical narrative that I think are anticipations of the novel. First, interior monologue. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about, interior monologue? Interior monologue, that's Virginia Woolf, or some novels by Faulkner. But interior monologue in the novel, in the Bible, well, it's there, but it's there on a very small scale. For example, when Saul determines to have David killed, the first time he determines this, because he's jealous of David's popularity and thinks David might be a threat to the throne, we have the following, and I quote pretty accurately, I think, from memory. And Saul said in his heart, that phrase introduces interior monologue, let not my hand be against him, let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So it's monologue unspoken monologue. He's saying it in his heart and not out loud. And there's a lot of that in the Bible. Second, you have free, indirect discourse. That is, it's a technique which is absolutely central to the novel, where the narrator's perspective becomes intertwined with the character's perspective. And sometimes you can't sort the two out very well. Again, it's on a much smaller scale, but it's there all over the place. Usually, it's introduced by a particular Hebrew word, hine. Now, hine, scholars call this the presentative. It's rather like voilà or voici in French. And it is often used as a shifter from the narrator's perspective to free, indirect discourse. For example, Jacob travels by foot all the way from the land of Canaan to Mesopotamia, and he lifted his eyes and saw and look, that is in the King James, behold, v'hinei, a well in the field. So when we get to the well in the field, it's Jacob looking. And then he looks again, and again hinei is repeated, and he says, and look, the stone was big over the mouth of the well. So there's Jacob sizing up the heaviness of the stone. Can I do this? Can I step up to this stone and roll it off the mouth of the well? So you see, the whole thing becomes much more vivid because of these sliding into the perspective of the character. Now, the final formal aspect of biblical narrative that I think is an anticipation of the novel is dialogue. And this is something I have to say I regretted not highlighting sufficiently in my book on biblical narrative. But it's dawned on me over the years that the real precursor to novelistic dialogue is dialogue in the Bible. Now here, let me step back just for a second to mention something that I should have mentioned earlier, that after Herder and Bishop Loth, a great milestone in seeing how the Bible fits into Western literature is the first chapter of Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, which appeared in 1946, I believe, and he wrote in exile in Istanbul, of all places, during the war. The first chapter is a comparison, brilliant like the whole book, between a scene from the Odyssey and the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 21. And the conclusion he comes to, it's an almost subversive conclusion, is that the real precursor of the novelistic representation of reality is not not Homer, but the Hebrew Bible. Now, what does this have to do with dialogue? Auerbach does not mention dialogue. After all, he's working within a limited scope in that single chapter. But when I say that dialogue in the Bible is the real anticipation of dialogue in the novel, I mean the following. You might object, well, what about the wonderful speeches in Homer? Now, there are wonderful and moving speeches in Homer, but the fact of the matter is they're really speeches. They're performances. Some of them go on for hundreds of lines. And the give and take between two characters in which each character is defined by the language that he or she uses is not present. Whereas you have this again and again in the Bible. And maybe since we're rushing on to 4 o'clock, I will content myself with 2 examples. The first, maybe the more obvious one, is the first time that Jacob and Esau, the twin boys, speak in their story. That is, I'll remind you, I'm sure it's familiar to almost all of you, that Jacob has gone out on a hunt. I'm sorry, Esau has gone out on a hunt, and Jacob is cooking this vegetarian delicacy, lentil stew, presumably in a big iron pot. And the hunt has not turned out well, so Esau returns, he smells and sees the lentil stew, and he says, "Give me some of the," no, he says, "Let me gulp down some of this red stuff because I am famished." Now, this violates the way you're supposed to speak in biblical dialogue. To begin with, there's a word used here that never anywhere else gets into biblical language. The word for "let me gulp down." It's a word that's used for feeding animals. The writer couldn't resist giving him a crude eating word. And then he can't even think of the nazid, the perfectly good Hebrew word for stew. So he says, "this red." That's the very literal way the Hebrew reads. And then that's not all in terms of the defining function of language. Jacob responds, and what does he say? He says, "Michla hayom b'choratcha li." It's 4 words in the Hebrew. Sell today your birthright to me. Now, notice the strategic order of the words. He's very brief, very calculating. First, the imperative verb, sell. Then, hayom, today. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. We have to close this deal. And then, what do I want you to sell? Your birthright. So that's pretty explosive, and he holds that back till the 3rd item in the sentence, and then lying in wait at the end of the sentence, to me. So what you have here is a deal maker, a shrewder deal maker than someone whose name I will not mention in this august company. And so you have this wonderful contrast in the dialogue between the brother who's totally impatient, can't even think of normal Hebrew words, and the brother who is calculating, who's watching his every step. Now, my last short example, and maybe for this I will need my light again, is an example of the way the biblical writers were willing to bend language in order to express dramatic situation, narrative context, the character of the person speaking. Again, I go back probably to the relief of the students in the room to the David story. You remember that after, those of you who just read it in class, after Absalom's rebellion is suppressed and Joab sees to it that Absalom is killed, a man named Ahimaaz decides that he will bring the tidings to David. Joab tries to dissuade him because David has a certain track record of killing the messenger, which doesn't happen in this case. So he sprints across the plain, Ahimaaz, arrives at the city of Mahanaim, where David has his capital in exile, and he says to him, your guys won the battle. You're safe now, king. And David says, I'll say this in Hebrew first so you can hear the pun. Ma shalom la na'ar av shalom. That is, and how does the lad Absalom fare? He's calling him the lad affectionately, even though Absalom tried to kill him. And at that point, here is Ahimaaz's response. I saw a great crowd to send to the king's servant Joab and your servant, and I know not what. And it breaks off. Now that's incoherent. And if you look at any English translation, I have to say except mine, you will find that it is doctored. It becomes a coherent statement. Because people say, hey, it's the Bible. The Bible has to always be coherent. But the fact is that his dialogue here expresses the fact that he's scared to tell David that his son died. So he starts babbling. And you can tell that he's babbling because David says to him, turn aside, stand by. I have no use to you, you're not giving me any information. And then a second messenger comes and tells him that Absalom has been killed. So you see, there's a kind of boldness in the reshaping of language for the narrative purposes of dialogue and for characterization. So in the end, I would say that the Bible as a whole has been both part of Western literature because certain writers over the ages and more writers in the 20th century have been very much aware of it and have tapped into it. And it's also part of Western literature in another sense, that the ancient Hebrew writers, as literary innovators, in certain important respects, anticipated things that would then become mainline practice in the works of literature we all treasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Sit down. Thank you very much. We normally allow a few minutes for questions afterwards,
sure.
And we usually like to let our students have the first shot at it. So if we have a student,
Okay, and would everyone who
and we would like you to use the mic. Is that
yes,
is that what you're
please
saying?
use the microphone.
Yeah, so that we can hear. Any questions from students first?
I hope I haven't intimidated the students.
Okay, I will switch to allow faculty and visitors to say. Chris, you want to say, and then Connie afterwards, and then we'll open it up for students again.
Hi, I was really struck. My name's Chris, visiting assistant professor in the English department. I was really struck by your reference to Potiphar's wife.
Yeah.
And when I was in grad school, we read The Lay of Lanval. I don't know if you're familiar with The Lay of Lanval. The Lay of Lanval, it's a story of the eponymous knight Lanval, and he's at Arthur's court. He's a bit of a stranger, and Guinevere takes a shining to Lanval, and he won't love her, and he's accused of rape by Guinevere, and the story gets more complicated after that. But the basic story is it's similar to Potiphar's wife. But what really interested me in that story and the connections to the past is when I was preparing to teach the Iliad here.
Yeah.
And in book 6 of the Iliad, there's this episode with Bellerophon and Glaucus, where they're exchanging Xenia hospitality, and there's a backstory. And Bellerophon's one sort of family connection, it involves this accusation, this false rape accusation that occurs, and that I think it was Bellerophon, or maybe it's Bellerophon's father, ends up being falsely accused by Anticlea, and then the father of Anticlea, or the husband rather, will not himself kill Bellerophon or Glaucus.
No.
So then he's sent to the father of the accuser, Anticlea's father,
Yeah.
and then he's sent with a letter. And he doesn't open the letter initially, then he puts him through Herculean tasks. So what's striking about that episode is it combines in Homer, in the Iliad, material from the false accusation from the beginning, and then that letter exchange that you were referencing later on. So I guess to make a long story short, I'm interested in the relationship between type scenes, particularly that type scene, the Potiphar's wife, between the relationship between Homer and the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about how there might have been that degree of transmission, the relationship between the Homeric and the Hebrew Bible.
Well, that's a good question. Now, there were, of course, contacts between ancient Israel and ancient Greece well before Alexander the Great's conquest of the Middle East. And, you know, there were trade contacts. The Hebrew writers knew about Greece because in the Table of Nations at the beginning of Genesis, one nation is mentioned with Yavan, which would have been pronounced Yawan in biblical Hebrew, which is iron in Greece. So it's conceivable that fragmentary bits and pieces drifted from one culture to another. Now, for example, the enigmatic bit in early Genesis about the sons of God coupling with the daughters of man, the Spicer Anchor Bible Genesis, Spicer suggests that this may have come from all those Greek stories that are like that, transmitted through Asia Minor. Remember, Asia Minor, more or less contemporary Turkey. Well, I just want to place it geographically, was a geographical bridge between Greece and the Levant. So some things, no doubt, got transmitted. I doubt if many whole stories did. Some of the similarities, I think, have to do with cultural similarities. That is, both these cultures, I was talking about this in the conversation I had at lunch, were warrior cultures. So certain aspects of warrior cultures, from taking the armor of a fallen foe as a trophy to the bond between fellow warriors and so forth, are similar. So I would be cautious about big chunks of material going back and forth.
Dr. Constance Rousseau, professor of history. You mentioned earlier about interior monologue as a literary device in the Bible, and you gave the example of Saul. I was wondering if you would consider some of the Psalms examples of interior monologue, at least in the sense of a person having a monologue, so to speak, speaking to God, thinking about and praying to God. Prayer as an interior monologue, as we see in
Yeah.
Psalms.
Well, I think it's formally different because some of the Psalms involve introspection and the speaker in the Psalm talking about I think it's usually his, not her, his experiences and his fears and aspirations. But I think because it's lyric poetry, you expect in a poem that a speaker will, especially lyric poetry rather than epic poetry,
Right, yeah.
that a speaker will reveal something of that person's interior world, maybe even a lot. But interior monologue is a formal device in narrative where the writer shifts from reporting external events to reporting what a character says to himself or herself.
Okay.
So that's it.
Yeah, thank you for the distinction.
Right.
Well, okay, let me give you one more example of interior monologue, because a particularly vivid one. You remember the story in Genesis 18 where Sarah eavesdrops on her own Annunciation story. She hears one of these visitors, who actually turns out to be God, saying to Abraham that this time next year you will embrace a son. And then we have the following. And Sarah laughed inwardly, saying, after being shriveled, shall I have pleasure? And I think pleasure, she means sexual pleasure. And she adds at the end of that little sentence, and my husband is old. She lays it. So you see, it's a wonderful representation of her inner sense of her woman's plight as a woman who is really very advanced in years, way past menopause, and has never had a child. And the very female physicality of it comes across in her words, and I think it could only be conveyed as interior monologue.
We have other questions?
Hi, I'm Sarah Heverin. I'm a sophomore math major, and I was wondering if, because we believe that, as Christians, and I'm not sure if the Jewish tradition would also incorporate this.
Wait,
but
I'm losing you. You
oh,
speak a
sorry,
little louder.
sorry. I'll try. Sorry. In the Christian tradition, we believe that the human has both. It's both divine and human. So,
Yeah.
do you find, in relation to literature, the fact that the Bible has a human aspect almost lends itself to be easily referenced, whether directly or indirectly, intentionally, unintentionally, by any sort of literary work that works to kind of comment on the human condition?
Yeah, well, I think that these biblical stories are quite profound reflections on representations of the human condition. And that's why they're so compelling to us, whether we read them from a fully religious perspective and assume, well, this is the way the inspired writers wanted to tell us the truth about the human condition, or whether we read them from a more strictly humanistic point of view. I think that there's a lot going after the first after the first chapter of Genesis, with the idea that humankind. By the way, I say humankind not because, well, not out of a radical feminist impulse, although I'm sympathetic with that, but because actually the word Adam, which is not a proper name in Genesis, it's he's always referred to as Ha-Adam, the Adam. Adam is a human being, not really differentiated between man and woman. So it's slightly, when you say man, it is slightly misleading. So the human was created in the image of God. Now, that can mean all kinds of things, and I in a brief response to your question, I won't try to exhaust it in any way, but I'd say the following. Okay, he's created in the image of God. Maybe for the very early writer, the writer that scholarship identifies as J, it might have in part meant that he looked like God. I would not exclude that as a possibility, because in Genesis, God looks like a human being. That is, when he shows up at Abraham's tent, Abraham simply thinks he's a wayfarer and doesn't recognize that God is his guest. But I think even there in the earliest stage, it probably means more than that. So it means that the human creature is capable of divine things, is capable of doing wonderful things in this world. But it's not a done deal. That is, the question is whether the human creature can live up to the potential of being created in God's image. And also on the neither negative nor positive side, in a slightly different direction, maybe the fact that repeatedly character in the Bible is represented as an enigma, as something unfathomable. Maybe that also is a way in which each of us somehow resembles God.
All right, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Alter. Okay. And please stay for the reception afterwards. We've set up all kinds of food and drinks for everyone. Thank you for coming.